Welcome to Personality Crisis. I am Dylan Ris, your host for this episode, and we are very honored to be joined today by a British author, journalist. You might know his work from the New Statesman or one of his best-selling books. Let's welcome Jonn Elledge to the podcast. Jonn, thank you for being here.
Thank you for inviting me. I love telling people about stuff. That's kind of what I enjoy doing with my time. So it's always nice to have an excuse to do it professionally.
Well, we love learning, and we love chiseling away at our vast ignorance. So yeah, you can perhaps help a little as our resident expert in the politics of the United Kingdom.
Well, I mean, the advantage from my point of view is like because you're American, then I can say any old shit, and you will probably imagine it's true.
We will believe it, exactly.
I don't need to be informed or anything.
I just learned that Churchill is no longer prime minister, and someone just took over for him, right?
What? Oh, Jesus Christ! I've got to go write a column. Okay, so what are we talking about?
Yes, it's true. We may know nothing about your country, but we're determined to learn. I do know that you have a new prime minister, Andy Burnham, of the Labour Party. It does seem that the phrase Labour prime minister has been very rare in the 21st century, but here he is trying to pick up where Keir Starmer left off. Or what should we know about Andy Burnham and UK Labour in 2026?
You say it's been rare in the 21st century. It's been rare ever. I think I was just counting in my head. I think Andy Burnham is the 8th Labour Prime Minister, 4 of whom have been in the 21st century. So this is very much a thing. You sort of you grow up, you learn about politics, you sort of imagine that it's going to be about half and half, and that's not historically been true. Generally speaking, I think in the 20th century, the Conservatives, the Tories, are in power for about 2/3 of the time. So Andy Burnham it's not unusual. In fact, these days it's incredibly usual to change prime ministers without an election midterm. It's a parliamentary system. This is entirely legitimate and allowed. What is unusual about Andy Burnham is that at the start of this year, in fact, I think at the start of May, he was not even in Parliament. He was a minister in the last Labour government until 2010. He was the shadow minister in opposition for a while, but then he went off to be mayor of Greater Manchester, which he's done pretty successfully. Mayors are a relatively recent addition to the British political landscape. They're not very powerful compared to mayors in most countries. But Andy Burnham's seen as having done a pretty good job. He was very popular up there. He did better than the Labour Party polling suggested he should in 3 different elections. He'd not really been hiding the fact that he wanted to be prime minister. He'd been quite transparent about that. And at the start of going into this year, everyone on the British left kind of knew that Keir Starmer had, this is a technical term, fucked it, and was doing incredibly badly and was on course to lose the next election quite badly, despite having an enormous majority in Parliament. But of the 3 leading candidates, there was Angela Rayner, who was formerly Deputy Prime Minister, but there was a bit of a scandal around some of her tax affairs, which is, I don't think it was entirely fair, but nonetheless, it's the kind of thing that tends to stick around. There was the Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, whose problem was he was from the right of the party. He would not have been very popular with the membership that was required to actually pick the leader. And also, his polling wasn't brilliant, but he was very ambitious, quite competent. He clearly wanted it. And the third guy was Andy Burnham. Everyone knew he wanted it as well. And it was, everyone was saying, well, it can't be Angela because of her tax affairs. It can't be Wes because everyone hates him. And it can't be Andy because he's not actually in Parliament. And there's no route to him becoming an MP. And then he managed to become an MP. So here we are. And it all happened, the logjam when it broke, it all happened incredibly quickly. As recently as I think maybe 2 months ago, it looked like we were stuck and nothing was going to change. And Burnham found a way back to Parliament. Another MP from the right of the party, Josh Simons, stood down to clear a path for him. The governing body of the Labour Party said it would not block him running this time, as it did in the previous election. And then he won that seat very, very convincingly, like against the main opposition. There were Nigel Farage's Reform Party. And it was, Makerfield was quite high on Reform's list of target seats. It was like 10th or something. So it was a seat they absolutely would expect to carry in the general election. And Burnham absolutely smashed it. He outperformed expectations by about 20 points, so even though he's not been elected by the country, that does feel like a bit of a mandate. And when that happened and he said he was going to run for the leadership, Keir Starmer said, okay, game's up. I resign. And that's the last 2 months.
So Burnham, in his outward personality and his sort of charisma, seems a departure from the other labor leaders we've spoken of, in the 21st century that you've alluded to, the Gordon Browns, the Jeremy Corbyns, the Keir Starmers. Burnham does seem different. Am I right that he's different, or is that just outwardly so?
I mean, they're all within a range. I think like something that Andy Burnham has that most Labour leaders historically have not. And the only exception I can think of leaping to mind is actually Tony Blair, who he's not similar to in many ways, but he exudes optimism. He talks, he came in and like literally before he entered Downing Street, in his speech on the steps outside, his first policy announcement was like, right, first thing, we're going to end rough sleeping. We're going to end visible homelessness. Now, he may or may not be able to do that. It's a complicated issue. He didn't actually manage to do that as mayor of Greater Manchester, though he did put quite a dent in it. But actually just saying, like, I'm going to use the power of government to make the world better is something that I think people on the left in this country have been a bit frightened to do. I mean, Keir Starmer was terrible at this. His first big speech as Prime Minister, well, firstly, he waited nearly 2 months before giving the set-piece speech, which is an incredible thing to do. But also then it was like, well, it's going to get better, but it's going to get worse before it gets better. Everything is awful. We're going to have a really tough autumn. Anyway, good luck, everyone. And it's just like, this is not what anyone wants. Like, optimism wins votes. Like, it's the kind of the Ronald Reagan Morning in America thing. Like, Reagan, it's not his politics are really not mine, but I absolutely see how, like, It's Morning in America is a much better campaign message than like everything is awful and we're all going to die. So Burnham is quite unusual for Labour leaders in that sense. He's very good with people. Like, even people who don't like his politics generally like him as a person. Like, I don't know anyone with a bad word to say about him personally. And this is a very weird thing for me. I suddenly find myself incredibly pro Burnham. If you told me this would happen 10 years ago, I would have been absolutely stunned by it, because I always thought he was a bit of a shyster. He's a bit of a weather vane. Like, he tells people what they want to hear. And I always found that a bit frustrating. Like, I first kind of came into contact with him when he was Secretary of State for Health at the tail end of the last government in like 2008, 2009, 2010. And one of the things he did was he signed off on privatising a hospital. And then when he was Shadow Health Secretary in opposition, his big campaign message was, I'm going to oppose NHS privatisation. And it's like, am I the only one who remembers this? Does he think we've just forgotten? So like, I was always a little bit cynical about him. And, I wrote a column a few years ago saying I was cynical about him. And I went to his campaign launch to be mayor of Greater Manchester in 2017. And his sort of head of press came up to me afterwards and was like, oh, Jonn, we were so enjoying your tweets, your sarcastic tweets about everything. Andy says you never say anything nice about him. Do you want to meet him? And just put me in front of him with no warning whatsoever for an interview. And, firstly, that is a very good technique for handling potentially hostile press. And secondly, I was kind of, I was just sort of impressed that he was like, no, I'm going to try and talk this guy round. And
Hmm.
that is very much his I mean, like what he did in Makerfield, like he was literally like saying to his campaign manager, like, I want to speak to all the reform voters, put me in front of the people who don't like me. Um, and after the last couple of years where the Labour Party has just been in a defensive crouch the whole time, in a way that I'm sure will be familiar to many supporters of the Democratic Party, it is kind of refreshing to see someone who's like, no, I want to go out there, I want to make a case for progressive change, and I'm going to do it to people who don't agree with me. Like someone who's like, both like, I want to speak to the other side, but I'm not going to be scared to say, here is what I believe.
Yeah.
So I'm actually feeling oddly optimistic about the guy.
And you've spoken about how Labor has failed to do that in the past. It does seem from afar that Labor has been served by the Tories on a silver platter, remarkable political opportunities which they seem to have continually squandered. There seems massive buyer's remorse on Brexit, and just that a lot of the Tory policies of the past 2 decades have not panned out. Am I correct about that? And has Labor squandered it to the degree it seems?
Labour has absolutely squandered it, but I do think it was a more complicated inheritance than it perhaps looks from afar. So firstly, well, let's do Brexit first. Brexit was obviously quite a narrow vote. It was kind of portrayed as overwhelming in a way that I think was actually a function of how close it was. Like, I think if it had been 60-40 in favour of Brexit, I think it would have been easier for the winning side to be magnanimous about it. But because it was 52-48, it was, clear, but not overwhelming. That kind of meant that everyone was, firstly, the Remain side, on which I very much count myself. I think Brexit was a stupid idea. The Remain side, we convinced ourselves maybe this wasn't a done deal. Maybe we can reverse this. And that meant the Leave side were very much, no, we need to kind of double down on this. We need to make clear that this is happening. So after the referendum, we had 3.5 more years of fights about it. So yeah, it was close. And the polling since then has become rather more convincing in favour of this was a terrible idea. Why did we do this? But there are a couple of complicating factors, one of which is the geography of this country. So again, like, although in terms of vote share, if you think of like how the US Senate works, where like in terms of vote share, like your country is not far off 50-50, maybe a bit more of it, maybe even a Democratic bias, right? But because of how the Senate works and the way that Wyoming gets the same number of senators as California, which by the way is fucking insane, but let's not dig into that right now.
Yes.
Because of that, there is sort of a Republican advantage. There is an advantage to more rural states, right? And there is a parallel with how Brexit has panned out over here, where even though it was 52-48, nearly 50-50 in terms of the vote share in the referendum, if you did it by the actual parliamentary seats, politics, politics professors worked out it was probably 2-1 in favour of Brexit. There were far more parliamentary constituencies that would vote Brexit than there were that would vote Remain. So that immediately makes it quite difficult to kind of like, in a parliamentary system, like there are just always going to be far more seats where the people representing them have an instinct to go, well, we can't push too hard against this. And that's just because of the same demographic and political forces, which you're certainly seeing in the US, because I've reported out there a little bit. Like, yeah, there's a lot of like, Rust Belt towns that in place, I've been to Youngstown, Ohio, for example. It really reminded me of a lot of the north of England, where it's places where, like, once upon a time, it's blue collar workers reliably voted for the left wing party, but the economy is gone. A lot of culture war has happened. Now they're kind of on the other side. And you can see exactly how that's happened. It's basically like the young people turn 18, go off to college and never come back because there are no jobs. And that has an impact on the makeup of these towns. We have a very similar thing. I think you're seeing that in a lot of the developed world, actually. But that means that all the kind of progressive voters pile up in the big cities and the university towns. And I'm sure that's a picture that will be, not unfamiliar from how things work in the US right now.
Certainly,
we have our own version of that. And that means that just all the Remain voters, like I'm speaking to you from the East End of London, It is incredibly Remain round here. Like it is very, it is very demographically mixed. It is very international. That is not true of large chunks of the country geographically. So that's one reason. But and also, just before I realise I'm just babbling at you, really. But before we leave Brexit behind entirely, it's not that simple as pressing a button and we go back in. Like there will have to be a complicated negotiation with 27 other countries, most of whom probably want us back in, but not necessarily all of whom, and all of whom would want us to be back in under certain terms. Like they do not want it to be up for debate again in 10 years' time. There will be France will want certain economic concessions, probably. There will probably be pressure for us to accept the euro. And all of these things, although there's probably strong support for going back into Europe in theory, all of these things could chip away at it in practice. Plus, everyone's exhausted. We spent years talking about Brexit. We have many other problems. So even though it probably has knocked 4 or 5% off GDP and means that, we now have to queue in an airport when we go on holiday in France, which is just embarrassing, quite frankly. Despite all that, I do kind of see where people talk about reversing Brexit as a 10, 20-year project. Nobody wants to prioritize it right now. The other way in which it's not as simple as saying, the Tories gave you an inheritance, so everyone just wants to reverse everything they did. One of the things the Conservative Party did was austerity. It was spending less on public services and, infrastructure, and just, it is very visible. You go around this country now, it is very visible that something is broken. Nobody has any money. The economy is buggered. And it does just mean it is quite difficult to just turn the spending taps on in the way that the last Labour government that came in 97, they were cautious about it at first, but just because they didn't want to kind of spook the markets or the Conservative marginal voter that won over. But they're in a position within a couple of years to go we're going to start pouring more money into the health service. We're going to start pouring more money into schools. The current government cannot do that because we literally do not have the money. We are now the poorest country in Western Europe, which was not true even 15 years ago. So it is, even though everyone would love to just kind of reverse the legacy of the Conservative government, but to do that, it costs, and we just don't have the cash right now. So that's kind of the note of pessimism around Andy Burnham, having been quite positive about him. The fear is that a lot of the things he wants to do are going to cost money, and it's not clear where that money comes from. And also, we need to spend more on defence, because a country that I'm not going to be rude enough to name is kind of threatening to pull out of NATO, and Europe has to sort of worry about Russia on its own these days. So yes, we all have to spend more money on that as well. So,
Will the British public and the British press give Burnham and his government the leeway to do this? I think of when Joe Biden took over for Donald Trump, and almost immediately within months, it's Trump might have done this, but it's been 3 months and Biden hasn't reversed that, certainly with the COVID crisis and other things. Could the same be happening in the UK, or is there a little more patience?
I mean, the press is, if anything, even more right-wing than yours. I mean,
sure.
A good rule of thumb is that because of different regulatory environments, our TV has historically been much more balanced than yours, although we now have this thing called GB News that for some reason the regulator doesn't want to touch, even though it's clearly breaking a lot of rules. Like Nigel Farage as a presenter on GB News. That is insane. But historically, our TV was much more balanced. Our print media was far more unhinged than yours, and very much biased to the right. Not universally. Most of the magazines I write for are on the liberal left, but there is a fairly strong right-wing bias in our press. There are far more right-wing titles than left-wing ones. So the press is absolutely not going to cut him any slack. And we're already seeing this. I mean, the Daily Mail's headline yesterday morning, which I can't remember, was so who's going to pay for this, Andy, or something, about ending rough sleeping. about, like, the first thing is that, it is appalling there are people visibly homeless on our streets. I think we should do something about that. It's, a significant quantity of money, but it's not an insane quantity of money. And we have newspapers going, well, that's a ridiculous thing to spend money on immediately. So the press is not going to have any patience whatsoever. I think, and I have more faith in Burnham being willing to ignore that, and some of his top team, like Ed Miliband, who was Labour leader some years ago, he's got a pretty thick skin because he was Labour leader many years ago. So they've kind of thrown everything at him that they can. Hopefully they will sort of ignore the noises off and just do what they think is right. The public, it could go either way. I think there will probably be a little bit of patience if there are enough changes happening quickly. Like, there've been a couple of policies announced very quickly that are designed to make people aware that there is a new guy at the top and they are trying to do something. There have been a couple of things, cost of living policies, like bus fares have been capped. They're taking some tax off energy bills. All these things are quite small, but they will hopefully be visible, and you sort of hope these things buy the time to do other things. But we'll see. I mean, like, one of the things about the economy having been, our economy has not really grown since the crash to any great extent. And that's going on 20 years now. And one of the things about an economy that isn't growing is it makes it harder to do redistributive policies, because for there to be a winner, there also has to be a loser. So there is a moment of optimism, but I don't know how long it lasts.
It seems to me that some of the slack that Labor might get hinges on the public's faith that government can be competent and administer these policies. In the U.S., we don't have that. And you mentioned Reagan earlier. I mean, Reagan's legacy, which extends today, incredibly consequential, where he, his famous quote was the scariest words in the English language, or I'm from the government and I'm here to help. And since that time, even in the face of obvious evidence to the contrary, people have just believed that the government is going to screw things up, to the point where when we've had hurricanes here, they've rejected government assistance from FEMA because they think they're going to make it worse. In fact, it's not the case. In the UK, it does seem that people have, because of NHS, because of other redistributive programs, people have more faith in government. But is that still the case? Do people believe that a Labour government can be competent?
We'll see. I mean, we do have a very different political culture to you, in that we don't have the sort of strongly anti-government thing that is. It's there from the beginning in the US, right? This is what Jeffersonianism is, right? It is one of the two strong forces in the early years of the Republic. We don't have that in the same way. We have parties that broadly favour a bigger government and parties that broadly favour a smaller government. But we don't have even like that, our sort of relatively hard right are not as anti-government as like some of the guys you've got in, like, I don't know, rural Idaho or something, who kind of like, who just don't ever want to see the government at all. Like,
no, you'll shoot them if they show up. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, we don't have that culture. But there is, but there are still, Margaret Thatcher wanted to decrease the size of the government. The last Conservative government, I mean, austerity was fundamentally a program of shrinking the size of the state. That's what it was for. And I do think there are ways in which you can sometimes see good arguments for the government doing less. If you go back to the mid 20th century, like, there were all sorts of things all sorts of publicly owned industries that from a modern perspective kind of look crazy. The idea that, like, car makers were publicly owned, that feels a bit odd. I don't think we're going to go back to that. So, like, sometimes I do think, I don't always think that, like, it is insane to say, well, the government should clear some space for business over here or whatever. But we do still have a fairly strong anti-government tradition. It's just not as strong as yours. But I think the big mistake that the Keir Starmer regime, the Labour Prime Minister and administration that have just gone after 2 years, made is just being in a defensive crouch the whole time, being so apologetic about being from the fucking Labour Party. It's like people elected you on a manifesto that had one word on the cover, and the word was change. Why are you so scared to look like you're going to change anything?
Is there anywhere in England that outside of London and the largest cities where maybe the culture is drifting toward the left? You mentioned how the north is sort of a rust belt of sorts, but again, in the US we do have areas, including in the South, where people move for jobs. The state of North Carolina, a lot of people were told by their companies, you're moving to Charlotte because we're we're reorganizing there, and actually that's pushed that state's politics somewhat to the left. Is there anything like that outside of your London's, Birmingham's, Manchester's?
Yeah, I mean, so the red wall that people refer to it as, meaning the sort of the seats in, they generally mean the north of England, but it's also large chunks of the Midlands are industrial as well. South Wales, historically the central belt of Scotland, but Scotland's got a whole different politics now because the SNP. But these are all the kind of, it's the industrial towns were the Labour heartlands for a long time, for most of the 20th century. Places that had mines or factories were where Labour got elected. And commuter suburbs were where the Conservatives got elected, and rural areas. That was kind of the split. And we've had a realignment the last few years that has seen the red wall, because it is culturally more conservative, because a lot of the young people leave to the big cities and so on, has sort of gradually, and because it was quite Brexit, because it was quite Levy, in a lot of those seats, like voting for Brexit was a sort of gateway drug to voting for more right-wing parties. So we've talked more about that side of the realignment, but there is a sort of mirror effect of that, where we are seeing, a lot of places we now think of as fairly solid Labour seats, university towns, Oxford, Cambridge, Brighton, Bristol, all these places were once more likely to be Conservative, and we sort of accepted them as like, well, now they're probably Labour, and that's a relatively recent thing. We are seeing a lot of commuter towns in the southeast of England, or coastal, relatively nice coastal towns, because people have been forced out of London by house prices, but they've not gone to these places and all started voting Tory. So a lot of those places are starting to go to the left. Also, it gets more complicated because we don't just have a two-party system anymore.
Yes.
So there is also a thing called the blue wall, which we've heard less about, but that's a lot of very affluent but historically quite pro-European seats in the counties around London, in places like Surrey and Kent, that are full of bankers, basically. Those have stopped voting Conservative in a way that should really be freaking the party out, in a way they are not panicking like they should. Those were largely won by a party called the Liberal Democrats, who don't let the name confuse you. They're actually our sort of centrist party. They are taking a lot of those seats because people in those places, they like low tax. They don't like giving all their money to the government, but they're not racist, and they don't want people to think they're racist. They probably quite like holidaying in the south of France and are a bit annoyed that they now have to queue at the airport and so on. So, the Conservatives have lost a whole bunch of seats. So, it is just a more complicated picture. But because of the media bias, which I've already talked about, and because, the right-wing newspapers are much better at getting, an echo chamber effect, then we hear far more about the Labour Party's problems than the ones facing the parties of the right.
So, unveiling your crystal ball, how do you, when Burnham himself has to stand for election as prime minister, how would you predict, when do you predict that election being called, and putting you on the spot, how will it go?
So the last possible date for it will be around 3 years' time. It'll be slightly after, the maximum length of a term is 5 years, plus a couple of weeks, I think, to the dissolution of Parliament. So it'll probably be around this time in 2029. It is possible Burnham goes to the country early because he wants his own mandate. However, that's risky. The polls the last couple of days have looked better. And Nigel Farage's Reform Party, that is kind of the biggest threat right now, is having a bad time. That's a whole different story, though. But it is possible that he wants to go to the country early, but it is very unlikely if he does that he won't lose seats, because Labour did win quite a big majority 2 years ago. So even if it goes really well, he will probably go from 160 seat majority to an 80 seat majority. And that's kind of a crazy thing to do. So I think probably he waits 3 years. What happens then? 3 years is a long time. We could be at war with, some might say we are at war with Russia, but we could be openly at war with Russia by then. By the time the next British election has to be called, Donald Trump should be out of the White House. It is extremely difficult to predict what it looks like. And I think it'll fundamentally be a race between the quite strong anti-reform feeling that will make a lot of people hold their nose and vote Labour, even if they don't think they want to right now. Against that, it's the economy isn't doing very well. The Strait of Hormuz is still closed. That increase in energy prices hasn't really fed into the state of the economy yet. Who knows? It's kind of going to be a race between. It'll all come down to the economy, basically, and how mad geopolitics is at that point. It is entirely possible that Labour holds on, or that it ends up in coalition with the Lib Dems. But I wouldn't bet against them losing. So that's not really an answer, but it's honest,
Well, yeah, it's honest, exactly, and the wide range there. Well, we'd love to have you back, and you said you would, so we'll have you back, and we want to talk about our friend Mr. Farage and how he might meddle in all this. But before we go on this episode, Jonn, what should we be reading of yours? Do you have any publications we might?
I'm very, very glad you asked. I have one of those Substack newsletter things, which is kind of just a weekly dump of the contents in my brain. So there's a bit of British politics, but there'll also be history or geography, or I'm a transport nerd, that pops up quite a lot, or just whatever I'm interested in this week. But I have a number of books out in the US. The most successful one is called A Brief History of the World in 47 Borders. But my lovely publishers, The Experiment, also brought out the back catalogue. So there's I should really know the name of what they've retitled the books, and I can't remember. That one of them is now called Elledge's Non-Trivial Trivia, which is a bit like the newsletter. It's all sorts of stuff. There's also a book on conspiracy theories, written by my friend Tom Phillips, and I really can't remember what they called it out there, which is a problem. But that's out. And I have a new one out in the autumn, which is the one I'm meant to be promoting, which is in Britain going to be 31 Inventions That Built Our World. The American edition, because America is bigger, is 32 Inventions That Built the City, I think. It is a history of the city, basically. You guys get an extra chapter because one of the ones we cut was about the LA streetcar conspiracy. And that's obviously a very American story. So my editor asked me to put it back in.
That's wonderful. Well, as a resident of LA, I'll go right to that chapter. And your Substack address is what's the URL?
It's Jonn, Jonn, because I'm pretentious, jonn.substack.com. And it's called The Newsletter of Not Quite Everything.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Jonn. We look forward to having you back, and we have appreciated a little bit of our ignorance being chiseled away on today's episode.
Thank you very much for having me. It's good to talk to you.
Thank you. It's an honor.